Hello everyone, welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and leave a comment below if you enjoy bedtime stories filled with mystery, suspense, and the unexpected. Your support helps keep the shadows alive and the stories flowing. Now, settle in, turn off the lights if you dare, and let's begin tonight's story. The basement apartment in Brooklyn. It was the spring of 2017, when the air in New York still carried a bite of late winter chill. James Callahan, a 27-year-old aspiring writer from Manchester, had just arrived in Brooklyn with a suitcase, a half-filled notebook, and the kind of restless hope that only someone chasing a dream could carry. He didn't have much money, and after a week of scrolling through endless listings on Craigslist, he finally stumbled upon a deal that seemed too good to be true, a basement apartment on Dean Street, right between Crown Heights and Prospect Heights. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Green, met James outside the brownstone on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The street smelled faintly of wet asphalt and food from a nearby Caribbean takeaway. Green was polite, though his eyes darted nervously whenever James asked questions about the building. "It's quiet here," Green said, fumbled with the keys as they stood at the wrought iron gate. "Perfect for someone like you, a writer, wasn't it?" James nodded. His heart beat faster when the heavy door opened. Inside, the hallway was dim, lit only by a single bulb that buzzed faintly. The basement apartment itself was small but livable. One bedroom, a kitchenette, a bathroom with peeling paint, and just enough space for his desk. The rent was half of what most places in Brooklyn demanded, and James quickly signed the lease, ignoring the landlord's insistence that he keep the basement door locked at all times. At first, life there felt almost cozy. James set up his desk against a narrow window that peeked out onto the street. At night, he could hear the faint rumble of the subway beneath his feet and the distant laughter of neighbors through the thin walls. He told himself this was exactly what he wanted, a quiet space, cheap rent, and the energy of the city just beyond his door. But within a week, small details began to unsettle him. The basement corridor, just outside his apartment door, always seemed colder than the rest of the building, no matter how warm the spring air became. Sometimes, late at night, James thought he heard movement beyond the locked basement door, the sound of dragging or something wet brushing against the concrete floor. One evening, around 11:45 p.m., James was at his desk, typing under the soft glow of a desk lamp. Rain tapped against the small window. That was when he heard again a muffled thump, followed by what sounded like someone whispering his name. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His rational mind told him it was nothing more than the pipes or perhaps neighbors upstairs. But the voice, it was too clear, too deliberate. The next morning, James confronted Mr. Green when he came by to collect the rent. "Is there something down there?" James asked carefully, nodding toward the basement door that sat heavy and dark at the end of the corridor. Mr. Green's face paled. He shifted uncomfortably, gripping the envelope of cash a little too tightly. "Don't go down there," he muttered. "You hear me? Don't. It's not part of your lease. Just stay in your unit and you'll be fine." Then he left, his footsteps echoing up the stairwell, leaving James with more questions than answers. That night, James lay awake on a narrow bed, listening. The city outside was alive. Horns honked. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone argued on the corner. But beneath it all, from the other side of that locked basement door, came a sound that didn't belong. A slow, scraping noise like nails against concrete. He couldn't shake the feeling that the landlord was hiding something down there. Something that didn't want to be hidden. The following day, James tried to brush it off. He told himself it was the stress of moving, the isolation of living alone in a new country, and the pressure to try and make something of himself as a writer. Still, the sound haunted him. Whenever he sat at his desk, pen in hand, the thought of that basement door tugged at the back of his mind. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch. By mid-April, the weather had begun to warm. Brooklyn sidewalks filled with people. Street vendors set up on corners, and Prospect Park bloomed with spring flowers. James spent his mornings in the library, drafting short stories, then returned to his apartment in the afternoons. He tried to stay busy, but every night the same routine unfolded. The scraping, the thuds. Once, he swore he heard breathing. On a Sunday evening, he decided to test himself. Around midnight, he sat on his bed, lights off, and waited. His phone showed the time, 12:17 a.m. That was when it came, the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps directly beyond the locked basement door. He held his breath, every nerve in his body straining. And then he heard it, a whisper, so faint he thought he imagined it. James. The voice knew his name. He leapt from the bed, heart hammering, and grabbed the baseball bat he had bought at a thrift store for protection. But when he opened his apartment door and peered into the corridor, there was nothing. The basement door stood still, its old metal lock glinting under the weak yellow light bulb. The air was colder there, the smell stronger, something sour, like damp soil mixed with rust. Sleep was impossible after that. He made coffee at 2 a.m., sat at his desk, and scribbled notes in his notebook. His writing shifted, no longer about love, cities, or fleeting moments. Instead, he wrote about shadows and basements, voices in the dark, and secrets buried under concrete. When he met with his friend Clara, a fellow writer from London who had been living in New York longer than him, he finally confessed. They met at a small cafe on Franklin Avenue, the kind of place with chipped wooden tables and jazz playing softly in the background. Clara raised her eyebrows as James told her about the noises. Old buildings make sounds, she said, sipping her coffee. Pipes, boilers, rats. You're probably psyching yourself out. It said my name, James whispered, leaning in closer. Twice. No one else was down there. Green told me not to open the door. Why would he say that if it was just pipes? Clara frowned. Green, was he the guy on Craigslist? Sketchy old man, right? James nodded. I'd be careful, she said finally. Some of these landlords, they'll hide things just to keep the rent cheap. Illegal sublets, mold, asbestos. God knows what. Maybe you should look for another place. But James couldn't leave. Not yet. The apartment was affordable, and he was barely scraping by. More than that, he was obsessed. Whatever was in that basement called to him. 2 weeks later, on an unusually hot April night, James came home late from a reading at a bookstore in Williamsburg. His shirt clung to him with sweat, his head buzzing from 2 glasses of cheap wine. As he stumbled into the corridor, he noticed something different. The basement door was slightly ajar. He froze, the hairs on his arms rising. The lock hung loosely, as if forced or forgotten. A faint draft seeped through, carrying a smell that made his stomach turn, rot mixed with earth. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing softly. No answer. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His phone's flashlight beam cut into crack, but revealed only darkness. James reached out, heart pounding so hard he thought his chest would burst. His fingers brushed the door, pushing it just enough to widen the gap. The sound that escaped was low and guttural, like something between a groan and a sigh. He stumbled back, slamming his apartment door shut. That night, he hardly slept. The next morning, determined, he knocked on Mr. Green's door upstairs. The landlord took an unusually long time to answer, and when he did, his shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face pale. "You opened it, didn't you?" Green hissed before James could even speak. His voice was a mixture of fear and anger. "It was already open," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's in there? Tell me." Green looked at him for a long time, his lips trembling as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't. Finally, he muttered, "Don't ever go down there. If you value your life, you'll stay away." And then he shut the door in James's face. The warning only fueled James's curiosity. By the end of April, his obsession had turned into a plan. He bought a padlock cutter from a hardware store, telling himself he needed it for emergencies. He kept it hidden under his bed, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on May 3rd, a night when the building seemed unusually silent. Rain fell heavy outside, and thunder rolled across the Brooklyn skyline. James sat at his desk, staring at the locked basement door through the crack in his own apartment doorway. His breath fogged the glass of his coffee mug. At 12:30 a.m., he grabbed the cutter. His hands shook as he approached the door. The air grew colder with every step, the smell intensifying until it was almost unbearable. He pressed the tool to the lock and squeezed. With a sharp snap, the lock fell. The door creaked open. Inside was a staircase leading down into darkness. The air was damp, heavy, and filled with the scent of decay. James raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were old brick, wet with condensation. Each step he took echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick air. At the bottom, the corridor stretched into two directions. To the left, a row of old storage rooms. To the right, something else. The floor was stained dark, and the faint outline of claw marks scratched across the walls. Then he heard it again. "James." This time the voice was clearer, closer, and undeniably real. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, the beam shaking in his trembling hand. The light fell upon something that made his stomach twist. A door with chains across it, rusted but still intact, and behind it, movement. Slow, deliberate movement. The chains rattled softly, though no one touched them. James staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Whatever was behind that chained door knew his name, knew he was there, and was waiting. The basement seemed to breathe with him, as if the air itself thickened to trap him in place. And then, from behind the door, came a sound he could never mistake again. The sound of nails scraping along concrete, dragging closer to where he stood frozen. Chat GP. James's breath came out in shallow bursts. His body was rigid, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The faint light caught the surface of the chains again, highlighting the rust, the dents, and the fresh scratch marks that didn't look like they came from metal tools, but from something far sharper. The basement air was damp and thick, but beneath the mildew and mold there was another odor, something putrid, almost organic. He stepped back slowly, his shoes crunching against the damp concrete. Every small noise echoed into the darkness. He told himself he would only peek, only look, just enough to satisfy the gnawing obsession that had plagued him since his first night here. But as soon as his light steadied on the chained door, the decision was already made. He couldn't turn back. "James." The voice came again, softer this time, almost coaxing. It was neither distinctly male nor female, but it carried a human cadence, a sound that didn't belong in this place. His throat tightened. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The only reply was a faint dragging sound, nails or claws against stone. Then silence. James's watch read 1:02 a.m. The rain outside continued to lash against the brownstone. A subway train rumbled faintly in the distance, reminding him that the city above lived on, unaware of what lay beneath. He felt impossibly cut off from it all, as though the staircase had carried him into another world. The corridor stretched further than he had thought. To his left, one of the storage doors stood slightly ajar. His beam caught the edge of something inside, an old chair broken, lying on its side. Dust floated lazily in the beam of his flashlight. He turned back toward the chain door. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, faintly, the chain rattled. Not violently, not as if someone were pulling, but just enough to let him know that whatever was behind it was alive. His rational mind screamed. This was madness. He should call the police, or leave the building, or at least slam the basement door and lock it again. But another part of him, the part that had brought him across the ocean to chase words and stories, refused to let go. This was a story. This was what had been waiting for him. He crouched, bringing his light closer to the base of the chain door. There, along the edge of the concrete floor, were marks. Dark stains, some old and brown, others fresher, seeping into cracks. His stomach lurched. He knew blood when he saw it. The voice came again, low and rhythmic this time. Not his name, but a series of sounds, muttered, whispered, as though from lips pressed too close to the crack in the door. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unsettling, like prayer or a curse. His phone buzzed suddenly, vibrating in his pocket. The sound nearly made him jump out his skin. He yanked it out. A text from Clara. "Hey, just making sure you're alive. You've been so weird lately. Don't disappear on me." James looked back at the chain door. He typed quickly, his hands shaking. "I'm in the basement. There's something here. I'll explain later." He hit send. The message showed delivered, but no reply came. He shoved the phone back in his pocket. The muttering behind the door stopped. Silence pressed in, heavier than before. Then 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, from the inside. His chest constricted. He staggered back, bumping into the brick wall. The knocks echoed down the corridor, each one reverberating in his bones. James realized his hand still clutched the padlock cutter. He stared at it, then at the chains. The thought burned through him. He could open it. He could know. But before he could act, a noise came from above. Footsteps, rapid and heavy, rushing down the staircase. The beam of another flashlight swung into the basement. "James!" a voice shouted. It was Clara. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, out of breath, her coat dripping rainwater. Her eyes widened when she saw the chains, the stains on the floor, and James standing pale and frozen before the door. "What the hell are you doing down here?" she hissed. James opened his mouth, but no words came. The voice behind the door had gone silent again, as though it had sensed her arrival. Clara grabbed his arm. "We need to get out. Now." But James resisted, his eyes glued to the door. "There's something here," he whispered hoarsely. "It knows my name." Clara looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. "I don't care if it knows your whole life story. We're leaving." She tugged at him hard, but James didn't move. The silence behind the chain door deepened, pressing into both of them. Then, faintly, something brushed against the door from the inside. A scrape that sent chills racing up their spines. Clara's grip tightened. "James, please." For a moment, he hesitated. The pull of curiosity warred with the instinct to survive. His body felt split in two, but the sound of another scrape, closer this time, made the choice for him. He allowed Clara to pull him up the staircase. His flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating more claw marks, more stains, the edges of things better left unseen. They reached the apartment corridor. Slamming the basement door behind them, Clara shoved the old lock back into place, though it no longer held properly. She pressed her back against the wall, breathing hard. "Are you insane?" she whispered. Her voice shook with anger, but her eyes showed fear. "Whatever is down there, it's not supposed to be opened." James collapsed into the chair by his desk, his hands trembling. "Green knows," he muttered. "He's keeping it down there, whatever it is." Clara crossed her arms, pacing. "Then call the police." Don't play detective. You're not writing some horror novel, James. This is real. But James couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The way it had shaped his name. The way it had paused the moment Clara appeared. It knew things, and it was waiting hours later, after Clara finally left. Unable to convince him further, James sat alone again. The rain had stopped. The city outside had grown quiet. In that silence, he thought he heard it, faint, muffled from beneath the floor. James. This time, the voice sounded almost pleading. His pen moved across the page of his notebook. Without him realizing it, words spilled out, lines he didn't think of consciously, sentences that seemed to come from somewhere else. When he looked down, he saw his handwriting forming fragments of phrases. "Let me out. It's cold here. You are the key." The notebook slipped from his hands. His skin crawled. The voice was not only calling, it was reaching through him. Sleep never came that night. When morning light finally seeped through the small basement window, James sat staring at the chained door beyond his apartment corridor. The sunlight didn't reach it. The shadows there remained thick, immovable. And though he told himself he wouldn't go near it again, deep down he knew he would. The pull was too strong. The mystery too consuming. Something in that basement had tied itself to him now, and it was only a matter of time before he returned. See, for the next 2 days, James tried to live as though nothing had happened. He forced himself to follow a routine. Wake up early, brew coffee in the tiny kitchenette, spend hours at his desk attempting to write, then take long walks around Prospect Park to clear his head. Clara texted him twice, urging him to leave the apartment, to find another place before he lost himself in whatever was pulling him toward the basement. But the words on the page betrayed him. No matter how hard he tried to write short fiction or essays for literary magazines, the same images emerged. Dark corridors, rusted chains, voices slipping through cracks in the walls. His notebook filled with phrases he could not remember writing. Sometimes he would look down and see entire paragraphs scrawled in a hand that looked like his own, but jagged, uneven, written as though in haste. By Wednesday, the weather shifted again. The Brooklyn sky hung low and gray, pressing the city into a mood of sluggish silence. James sat by the small window, staring at the street above. People passed by, children with backpacks, women with grocery bags, men hurrying with umbrellas. Ordinary life. Yet beneath it, he felt the hum, that unshakable awareness that something below him, only a wall away, was waiting. That night, he dreamt vividly. He was standing in the basement corridor, flashlight in hand, the chained door before him. From behind it, pale fingers pushed through the gaps, stretching, grasping. The voice whispered his name, but this time it was not one voice. It was many, overlapping, urgent, like a crowd pressed into darkness. He tried to turn away, but the floor beneath him grew soft like mud, sucking him down. When he woke, his bed sheets were damp with sweat, his throat raw as though he had been calling out in his sleep. The dreams returned the next night, and the next. By Friday morning, his reflection in the mirror startled him. Dark circles under his eyes, skin sallow, lips cracked. He barely ate. He drank coffee and whiskey, scribbled frantically in his notebook, and stared at the basement door as though it might open on its own. That evening, as he climbed the stairs to buy groceries, he caught sight of Mr. Green. The landlord was standing at the top of the building steps, speaking quietly to a woman James had never seen before. She wore a long gray coat and carried a folder tucked beneath her arm. When she noticed James, her eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, her expression unreadable. Green quickly ushered her away. James waited until Green returned alone before confronting him. "You know what's down there," James said, his voice shaking with exhaustion. "Why do you keep it locked? Who are you hiding from?" Green's eyes darted nervously. You don't want to know. I already do, James pressed. It talks to me. For the first time, something like fear flickered across the landlord's face. Then it's chosen you, he muttered. His voice was low, but the words cut deep. He turned and walked away, refusing to say more. The phrase burrowed into James's mind. It's chosen you. Later that night, around 2 in the morning, he sat at his desk, unable to write. The city outside was unusually quiet. The hum of traffic, the occasional siren, all absent. Only the faint drip of water somewhere in the pipes filled the silence. Then, so softly he wondered if it was in his imagination, came the voice again. James, please. It was different now. Less threatening, more pleading. It sounded almost human, almost desperate. His chest tightened. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath him, and stepped into the corridor. The light bulb overhead flickered. The basement door loomed, slightly warped, the old lock hanging loosely. He thought he saw the faintest tremor in the metal, as though something pressed gently against it from the other side. Tell me who you are, he whispered. The silence stretched unbearable. Then came a sound that froze him in place. A sob, low, muffled, like someone crying into their hands. His hand hovered over the lock. He wanted to break it open, to see the face behind the voice. But fear gripped him. If he opened it, he wasn't sure he would return. He backed away, closed his apartment door, and pressed his back against it, shaking violently. The following day, he decided to investigate. He spent hours in the Brooklyn Public Library, combing through archives, scrolling microfilm, searching for records of the building. The brownstone on Dean Street, he discovered, had been built in 1894. Over the decades, it had changed hands many times. In the 1940s, it was converted into apartments. But in the 1970s, reports of missing tenants surfaced. 2 women, 1 man, all of whom lived in the basement units. No bodies were ever found. The landlord at the time disappeared shortly afterward. James's pulse quickened as he scribbled notes. His building had a history, a dark one, but the trail went cold. No police follow-up, no arrests, no newspaper coverage beyond a few brief mentions. It was as though the story had been buried. When he returned that night, he found something waiting at his door. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, tucked under the handle. He unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was spidery, uneven. You cannot save them. Do not open the chains. There was no signature. James sat heavily on the bed, staring at the note. He thought of Green, of the woman in the gray coat, of the phrase that echoed in his skull, "It's chosen you." Sleep evaded him again. The dreams grew worse. Now he saw faces in the darkness, pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror. They pressed against the chain door, mouths opening and closing without sound. When he woke, his throat burned, his fingernails caked with dirt, though he hadn't left his bed. By Monday, Clara returned. She knocked on his door sharply, her voice urgent. "James, open up. You haven't answered my texts." He let her in reluctantly. She gasped when she saw him, unkempt, unshaven, his apartment littered with empty bottles and papers filled with frantic writing. "You're scaring me," she said softly. "What's happening to you?" James tried to explain, his words tumbling over one another, the voices, the sobbing, the history of the house. Clara listened, her face pale. When he showed her the note, she shook her head. "This isn't healthy," she whispered. "You need to leave. Tonight, come stay with me. Whatever is down there, it's eating you alive." But James couldn't. The pull was too strong. The whispers too insistent. As Clara pleaded, he found himself glancing past her to the basement door visible through the crack. The shadows seemed to shift, For a brief second, he swore he saw fingers curling around the frame, then disappearing. He blinked hard, his pulse thundering. Clara grabbed his shoulders. "Promise me you won't go down there again," she begged. James couldn't answer. He only lowered his eyes. That night, after she left in frustration, James sat awake until dawn. The whispers came and went, drifting through the walls, weaving into his thoughts. He no longer knew if they were real or if his mind was breaking. But one thing was certain. He would return to the chained door, not out of choice, but because something deeper than choice compelled him. And as the morning sun spilled weakly through the window, he realized a truth he hadn't dared to say aloud. The basement wasn't just calling him. It was claiming him. The days that followed blurred into one another. James no longer lived in the rhythm of the city outside, but in the pulse of the building itself. He slept in short, broken intervals, waking to the sound of faint whispers, then drifting again into uneasy dreams. Food lost its taste. Sunlight hurt his eyes, and he barely left the apartment except to pace the narrow corridor, staring at the chained door like a moth hovering near a flame. On the evening of May 12th, a Friday, he made another discovery. His pen had rolled beneath the radiator, and when he crouched to retrieve it, his fingers brushed against something wedged between the wall and the floorboards. He pulled it free, a small leather-bound journal. Its cover cracked and brittle. Dust clung to its surface. The initials J.H. were faintly embossed in gold on the front. Heart pounding, James opened it. The handwriting inside was uneven. Some lines scribbled frantically, others carefully written. The first dated entry was from 1973. "They won't let me leave. The voices call each night, and Green says we must keep the chain secure. But I don't know how much longer. They know my name now." James turned the page, his breath shallow. Another entry, dated 2 weeks later. 3 more gone. The basement feeds, though Green pretends nothing is wrong. "We are caretakers," he says. "Guardians. But I can't bear the cries. I see their faces in my sleep." The final entry was smudged, water-stained. Only fragments remained legible. "The chains are weak," it chooses. "I cannot." The writing cut off mid-sentence, as though the pen had been dropped. James closed the journal, his hands trembling. J.H., whoever this was, had lived in the same building, perhaps even the same basement unit, and they too had been chosen. He tried to show the journal to Clara the next morning, but she refused to come down. They argued on the street, the spring sun too bright against James's pale skin. Clara's voice shook as she said, "If you stay here, it will kill you, or worse. Don't you see? This isn't curiosity anymore. It's possession." But James couldn't leave. The idea of walking away from the basement, from the voice, from the truth beneath the chains, filled him with a strange grief, as though leaving would mean losing a part of himself. He tucked the journal into his jacket pocket and returned inside. That night, the whispers began earlier, around 9, while the building above was still alive with footsteps, televisions, and faint music. James sat at his desk, the journal open beside him, and listened. "James." The voice stretched his name, lingering on the syllable, almost tender. Then came a second whisper, and a third. Soon, a chorus, overlapping, weaving together into something almost melodic. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was inside him now, vibrating in his chest. The light bulb in the corridor flickered. He rose, drawn once again to the basement door. His fingers traced the cold metal of the chains. He felt heat beneath them, faint but real, as though something alive pressed against the other side. The sobbing returned, louder now, a woman's voice distinct. He could hear her breathing, ragged and shallow, her fists striking the wood. "Please," she whispered. "It's so dark. Please." James's throat ached. "Who are you?" he whispered back. No answer, only weeping. He stumbled back into his apartment, heart hammering. He poured whiskey into a chipped glass, gulped it down, and stared at the journal. The final page seemed different now, as though the ink had shifted. He rubbed his eyes, leaned closer. Words appeared faintly where before there had been none. Open it. His blood went cold. The following day, Saturday, James tried to distract himself. He walked for hours through the city, from Prospect Park to Brooklyn Bridge. Crowds pressed around him, laughter and music filled the streets, but all felt far away, like a film playing on mute. When he returned home in the evening, the note from before, the one warning him not to open the chains, was gone from his desk. In its place lay another scrap of paper. You are the last. His hands shook as he crumpled it. The urge to run fought with the pull to stay. He thought of Clara, of her pleading eyes, but even her voice had begun to fade against the chorus in his head. That night, the dream was different. He wasn't in the corridor. He was inside. The chain door had opened, and he walked into a vast chamber, deeper than any basement should be. Figures moved in the darkness, gaunt and faceless, reaching for him. One of them spoke directly into his ear. You belong here now. He woke gasping, his fingernails again filled with dirt, his feet stained as though he had walked barefoot through soil. Sunday evening brought a storm. Rain battered the narrow basement window. Lightning flashed across the city, and thunder shook the building. James sat awake, staring at the basement door. At 12:13 a.m., the chains rattled. Violently this time, jerking against the wood. He froze, the flashlight in his hand trembling. Then, unmistakably, a voice screamed. Not whispered, not coaxing. A full, raw scream of pain and fury, filling the entire basement. James staggered back, his flashlight beam jerking across the corridor. The bulb above him burst with a pop, plunging him into darkness. The scream cut off. Silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. And then came the knock. 3 times. Slow, deliberate. He gripped the padlock cutter in his hand, his knuckles white. Sweat ran down his back. His mind screamed at him to run, to lock his door and never look back. But his legs carried him forward, step by step, closer to the chains. The air grew thick, foul, almost liquid in his lungs. He pressed the flashlight to the door. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, something pressed against the wood from inside. A shape, a face. Pale skin stretched thin, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent wail. James stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his hand. It clattered against the floor, the beam spinning wildly across the walls, catching glimpses of claw marks, stains, and for the briefest second, another face pressed beside the first. Then another, dozens of them. The voices rose in unison, not whispering now but chanting, their words overlapping until they filled the corridor. Open, open, open. James covered his ears, but it made no difference. The sound vibrated in his skull, in his bones. His vision blurred, the corridor spinning around him. He fell to his knees, clutching the padlock cutter, the urge to snap the chain stronger than anything he had ever felt. In the chaos, one voice rose above the others. Clear, familiar, Clara's. James, it said, calm, pleading. Don't. He froze. The chanting faltered. The faces behind the door pressed harder, their mouths wide in silent rage. The air grew colder, the smell of decay choking him. His hand trembled. He looked down at the cutter, then up at the chains. The metal gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam. His choice hovered before him, terrible and irresistible. The basement waited. James sat there on the damp basement floor for what felt like hours, the padlock cutter heavy in his hands, his body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The faces pressed against a wooden door seemed to waver like smoke, sometimes distinct, sometimes melting into the grain of the old timber. He could still hear Clara's voice echoing inside his mind, soft yet firm, almost like she had been standing right behind him, whispering into his ear. It had stopped him. For now, the storm outside had passed by the time he crawled back into his apartment. The windows were fogged, the air inside stale and heavy with the smell of mildew and whiskey. He sat at his desk staring at the journal, his thoughts tangled. Had Clara really spoken to him through the door, or had the voices simply used their tone to break him further? He wanted to call her, to hear her voice again, but he couldn't bring himself to. The last conversation they'd had ended with her tears, with her begging him to leave Brooklyn and never return. He had shouted at her then, told her she didn't understand, told her that he had to stay. And the truth was, he still felt that way. For 3 days after the storm, James barely left his apartment. He kept the curtains drawn tight, a stack of empty takeout, containers growing on his kitchen counter. He wrote in his notebook compulsively, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours straight, his hand cramping, his eyes bloodshot. The words came too quickly, and they weren't always his. He would look down and see sentences forming on the page he didn't remember composing, entire paragraphs that spoke of ancient guardians, rituals, and a hunger that had lived beneath the city long before the first brick townhouses were built in Brooklyn. The nights were worse. At first, it was just the whispers returning, soft and persuasive. But then came the knocks again. 3 at first, spaced out, measured, deliberate. Then 4, then 5. By the 5th night, the knocking never stopped. James hardly slept at all. He began to feel watched, not just from the door in the corridor, but from inside his own apartment. Reflections in the mirror didn't quite move the way he did. Shadows seemed thicker than they should be. And once, when he passed a narrow bathroom mirror late at night, he swore he saw someone else's face looking back, pale and unfamiliar. On May 18th, the journal changed again. He had left it closed on the desk, but when he returned from a brief walk to clear his mind, the cover lay open, the pages fluttering as though a breeze had passed through. In the middle of the book, beneath the smudged final entry, new handwriting had appeared. You cannot keep it shut forever. He slammed the book closed, his stomach twisting, sweat beading along his forehead. He wanted to burn it, to throw it into the trash, to be rid of it once and for all. But when he lifted the journal to toss it aside, he froze. He could hear something inside it, faint, like a heartbeat. That night, James dreamed again of the basement chamber, but this time it wasn't empty. He saw rows of wooden pews, like an underground chapel, filled with figures seated in silence. They all turned their heads toward him in unison, their faces pale and slack, eyes wide and unblinking. At the far end of the chamber stood a pulpit, and behind it, a man in a dark coat with graying hair. His face was calm, almost kind, and though James had never seen him before, he recognized him instantly from the journal's entries. Green spoke, his voice steady, commanding. The chains are not to hold it back. The chains are to hold you out. You don't belong, James. Not yet. James woke with his sheets soaked in sweat, his chest heaving as though he had been running. His fingernails were again packed with dirt. By May 20th, something had shifted in the building itself. The neighbors he sometimes heard above had gone silent. The usual hum of footsteps, televisions, and plumbing pipes was gone. It was as though the building had emptied overnight. When he checked the mailboxes in the lobby, every slot stood open and bare. No envelopes, no junk flyers, nothing. Dust lined the corners as if no one had been there in weeks. The silence pressing on him. He walked back to the basement door and laid his palm against the cold wood. There was no sound from within, no whisper, no knock. Just silence. Somehow that was worse. On May 21st, Clara returned. She had been gone for over a week, and James hadn't expected her. He heard her footsteps descending the stairs before the knock on his apartment door. When he opened it, she stood there, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him like he was someone she had lost. "You look sick," she whispered. "I'm fine," he lied. His voice was hoarse, his body thinner than before. Clara stepped inside cautiously, her gaze scanning the room, lingering on the open journal on his desk. "You have to leave," she said again, more desperate this time. "This place isn't right. It's changing you. Can't you see?" James shook his head. "No, it's giving me something. My writing, Clara. You don't understand." "I do understand," she interrupted sharply, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Because I saw it too. That night, when I left you, I couldn't sleep. I dreamed of this building, of that door, and I heard them. James, they know me now, just like they know you. If you keep this up, they won't let either of us go." Her words cut deep, but James couldn't bring himself to move. He wanted to hold her, to beg her to stay, but his mind was already drifting toward the corridor, to the silence behind the chained door. That night, Clara stayed. They sat together on the couch, both of them tense, waiting. For hours, the building remained silent. Then, around 2 in the morning, the chains rattled again, slowly at first, then violently. Clara's hand clutched James's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't go," she whispered. But James was already on his feet. He walked into the corridor, the flashlight shaking in his grip. Clara followed close behind, her breathing ragged. The chains rattled again, louder this time, the padlock straining against the loops of iron. Then a voice spoke, not a whisper, not a scream, a voice, deep and resonant, filling the entire corridor as though it had been waiting centuries to be heard. "James!" The flashlight flickered, then went out. The chains groaned, and then, with a sound like thunder splitting the earth, one of them snapped. The padlock fell to the floor. Clara screamed. James froze, his entire body locked in place, as though invisible hands gripped his limbs. The door trembled, dust shaking loose from the frame, the wood bowing outward as though something immense pressed against it. A foul wind rushed through the corridor, carrying the stench of decay and damp earth. In the darkness, he could see the faint outline of faces pressing against the door again, dozens, maybe hundreds, their mouths opening in unison. But this time, they weren't asking him to open. They were smiling. The building above groaned, the pipes rattled violently, and the very foundation seemed to shudder. Clara pulled at James's arm, screaming for him to run, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the ground, his eyes locked on the door as the second chain strained and groaned. The voices rose, louder and louder, until it felt like the entire block could hear them. And then, with a sudden snap, the second chain broke. The door creaked open an inch. A sliver of darkness spilled into the corridor, thicker than shadow, colder than night, seeping across the floor toward James's feet. His breath caught in his throat. He could see nothing inside, but he felt an ancient hunger, vast and endless, waiting for him. Clara yanked on his arm again, sobbing, begging him to move. But James only stared into the gap, the padlock cutter still clenched in his hand. The basement was opening, and it was calling his name. The basement door stood open, just a crack, but it was enough. From that thin line of darkness, something seeped out that no words could describe. Not a shape, not a sound, not even a presence. Something deeper than that. It was the weight of an old hunger, the kind that had been waiting longer than the city itself, patient and unbroken, like stone beneath the earth. James could no longer breathe. His chest rose and fell quickly, but each gulp of air felt heavier, as if his lungs filled with smoke. The corridor stretched before him, warped and unnatural. the walls bending, the floor sinking. Clara's sobs came from somewhere far behind, muffled as though underwater. The second chain hung broken, the iron links scattered across the damp floor. Only one remained. It groaned, trembling, the padlock clattering against the wood, with each violent pull from the other side. The door shuddered with every strike, the hinges screeching, dust raining from the ceiling. Clara screamed his name again and again, pulling at him with desperate strength. Her nails scratched into his skin, but James didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the gap. He thought he saw something move there, just beyond the blackness. A hand, pale and long-fingered, pressing lightly against the edge of the door. A smile curling in the void, wide and endless. And then he heard it. Not a whisper, not a scream, not even the deep voice that had called him before. This was something else. A sound like thousands of voices speaking as one, vibrating to the concrete, rattling in his bones. They didn't call his name this time. They laughed. The chain snapped. The door swung wide open. The corridor exploded with darkness, flooding outward like a tide. The flashlight in James's hand burst, the bulb shattering, leaving only black. Clara shrieked, her voice tearing into night, but James could barely hear her. The laughter drowned everything, louder, louder, until it was all that existed. And then silence. When the neighbors reported the next morning that the old brownstone smelled of rot and smoke, no one went inside. The building was condemned a week later. By June, work crews boarded it up, its windows sealed, the basement bricked shut. No one ever saw James or Clara again. Some said the young writer had fled the city, abandoning his apartment and his unfinished manuscript. Others whispered he had gone mad, wandering into the streets at night, muttering about voices beneath the floorboards. But the truth remained locked behind the boarded door. Sometimes on quiet nights, people walking past the empty brownstone claim they hear knocking from the basement, 3 slow raps, then silence. Others say if you press your ear to the boards, you'll hear faint voices whispering names, always names. And if you listen long enough, maybe you'll hear your own.